My name is Ethan, and I'll be your instructor for the day. So if you're here today, it means you want to get more familiar with Xcode and get started. So assuming you have downloaded Xcode from the App Store, you can find it by clicking on Finder, Applications, and as you scroll down or up, depending on wherever you start, you can find it. If not, you can always search for it. And to get easy access to it on your desktop for later, you can click and drag it onto your desktop wherever you want it. Since I have a few versions of this now, just for example, this one's number 2, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So when opening Xcode, this is a platform for Apple product development, or Apple product app development, sorry. We're going to start with creating a new Xcode project to get familiar with this. We want to choose iOS, single app view. And for a product name, this will be the name of our app. We're going to name it Hello World 3. And your organization identifier may be empty. In case it is empty, you can always put example.com, so no worries there. And you can always choose where it is saved to. For me, I saved it onto my desktop into a folder that I created. And I'm going to push create. And now we are in Xcode. If you look here, this area is considered our navigator. This area is our editor. And this area is our utilities page. If we look right here, this will allow us to hide, show utilities, our debugging, or our navigator. This will become more important later as we may want more room. But to start off with more room, we're going to go ahead and make it full screen. And looking here through our navigator, we can see every set and subset. And this is our project, Hello World 3. Within it is 2 files for source code, a storyboard, and assets. But we're going to go ahead and click on this just to look at it. And looking at the source code, the view controller will be the source code connected to our first scene, which will be the opening screen when you open up the app. And we can always check this by clicking on main storyboard, which gives us a nice visual and interactive to see what our app is looking like. There's only one screen that is defined, which is our view controller scene, and this is the source code. No worries, we can edit the code for our scene while looking at it. To do so, you want to click on the Show the Assistant Editor. This will allow it to be side by side, and this was kind of what I was referencing earlier. Depending on what you're doing, you may want to save on room. For now, I don't think we'll be messing for the navigator for a bit, or at all for the rest of this project. So I'm going to close that for more room. I'm going to limit this size just so we have more room to look at our scene and our source code. Everything's looking good so far. We see that there's not much here, but there's also not much on our beginning scene. So we can look at what else is encompassed within our scene. And so far, there is not really anything. So we're going to add some objects to our scene, I guess. Initially, yours will probably look like this along the utilities on the bottom right, on the Show the File Template Library. But since we want to look at objects and add objects to our scene, we're going to click on Show the Object Library. And just to get started, we're going to look for a text field. And there is one. We can click and drag it directly onto the scene, which is a nice feature on Xcode. If you notice, as I move it left to right, I was trying to get it centered along the x-axis, and there's a grid line to help us with that. So I'm going to put it right here, and just for clarification, the x-axis is from left to right, and the y-axis is from top to bottom. So we're looking here. Yours most likely looks like this on your utilities page. not much we're going to do on there, so we're going to look at our attributes inspector. We notice that this is a plain text field. We can add text. This is going to be our Hello World app. And so we want to welcome the user, say hello to the world, hello to the user. So we're going to start, well, we're going to say enter name here so that we can get the user to put their name and then give them a proper greeting into the app. So we did enter name here. You can see that there's fonts and colors. And later on, you can even change its background tint. If you wanted to add color and get more fancy, you can see how there's a lot of modes of customization given by the attributes inspector. Okay, now we have our text field and we're done. We're going to say enter your name here. So we're going to push the return key. We notice that the text isn't really fully shown. We don't want to confuse our user, so we're going to make it bigger. For now, it seems a bit cut off towards the bottom, but we don't really need to worry about that now because when we run the simulator, you'll see why. But speaking of the simulator, right now it's set to an iPhone 8 Plus. When we want to run it, you can see there's all these simulators that we can see what our app will look like on. If you scroll all the way up, if you have an Apple device that you have connected to your laptop, you can use your phone or tablet as a simulator just to see what it looks like. But for now, I'm going to stick with the iPhone 6 just because I'm a fan of the iPhone 6. Now we have our text field. Let's add a label. This is going to be what says hello to the world and hello to the user. So we're going to go up and down. We see that this is the exact center of the screen, vertically and horizontally. So instead of it saying label, I want it to say hello. We're going to press the return key, and we see that it does that. Then we're going to enter a slide or a slider, and later we're going to use this to edit the font size of the word hello. And then we're going to add a button, and what the button's going to do is whatever they entered within the text field will be entered into the label, and so we give a proper greeting to our user. If we look here, this looks great. So we can press run on the simulator just to see what it looks like. Of course, when opening the simulator for the first time with Xcode, it will take a little bit. And so when going back and forth, there are ways to put the simulator to sleep so that it doesn't take quite as long next time on the startup. So now it's open, our simulator is running, and now our app is loading onto it on the interface. Because this is considered a GUI, graphics users interface. So here we have our text field, which allows the user to type whatever they wish. Say, set enter name here. So for now, I'm going to go and call myself Mr. Instructor. And of course, that doesn't really do anything now. Like I said, this will change the font size, but it's not doing it. And our button doesn't do anything yet. So now we're going to go back to our source code and start making connections so that our objects will have purpose. So to put the simulator to sleep, we can push Command H. That way it doesn't fully terminate it, but just puts it on rest. Another way to do that is like you could always just press the pause key, which finished running the app. And so now we're going to look at here. We want to connect our objects from our object library. to our source code. And so to do that, we're going to click on the object we want to reference. And while holding down the control key, I recommend pushing the control key down first. And as you see, Xcode makes a nice line for reference and does most of the referencing for you. So now we need a name for our text field. So I'm going to name it name text field. And if you notice, our connection is an outlet. There's outlet action and outlet collection. For the purposes of this hack, we'll be mixing with outlet and actions only. You want to typically use outlets when your object has data you want to interact with, and actions if you only want it to compute or do something the moment the user interacts with that object. So for now, we only want an outlet on our text field, just because it's going to have the data of their name, and we want to manipulate that and store it. So we're going to push connect, and if you see, it automatically defines it for us. It's called IB outlet weak variable name text field with UT text field. And an IB outlet is just a defining name that Xcode does for us that references this direct variable to that direct object on the left. You can see it highlighted when I hover over this dark circle. And the exclamation point at the end just means that this reference or instance of this object may or may not have anything stored within it. But let's go ahead and do this for the other ones. At least for our slider and our label. This is going to be the name of our label. It's an outlet, which is going to be nice. We want this to display the user's name eventually. So we're going to call it name label. And I find it in good practice to keep similar objects instantiated together just for clarity for you as a developer. Because working on stuff later on, it could become confusing if things are mixed all over the place with instantiations of objects and variables mixed in your code. Now I want to create an outlet for the slider. Another thing we can do in case you're not comfortable clicking on the object on the storyboard is click on the left on our controller scene, hold down Control, and click and drag from there to your code. Of course, this is something similar, and this is going to be our slider that changes the font of our label. So we're going to call this one size slider. That way, the data we want to get from it will be what size we want to have the font. Next, we can go on to defining some functions for our actions. So we're going to click and drag from the button. We're going to make it an action. And our button, it's its action. It's going to take whatever we had in the text field and upload it into our label. So we're going to call this name changer, just because it's going to change what's on the name of our label. Now we're going to make a function for our slider. So we're going to make it an action. And whenever someone messes with it and moves the slider from left to right, we want it to change the size. So we're going to call it name change size. That way we know it will change the size of the font, and that's what it's intended for. And as we're looking at this, this is good as the main frame. We can look to our left. Things look good for the most part, but we want things to be clear for our user. And having a button that's just called button is nice, but it may not be the most clear and efficient way of getting its point across. So something we can do is change the name to submit. This will let the user know that once they enter the name, they can push submit and see what happens. For our name changer, I will start for the button's action. And previously we mentioned this is our label. It says hello, but we want it to say hello to the name of the person, and that's entered here in our name text field. So first we're going to take whatever name they entered. So we're going to let name equal to name text field dot text, and that will send the text that's in the name field to this variable that we just instantiated. Now we're going to manipulate the name and text within the label. So we're going to say name label is our name label dot text is going to be equal to hello, because we want to give our user a proper greeting and a space. And what we're about to do is called concatenation, and it's which you put two strings together. So we're going to say hello plus the name of the user, and we want to let them know that we're excited that they're using our app, so we're going to put a little exclamation mark. Now if you see, it gives us a little error. That value of the optional string, which is not unwrapped, asks us if we want to use an exclamation mark or question mark. And the reason for that is because in the text field, as mentioned earlier, the exclamation mark means that the object may or may not have any value. So name may have some value, but at the same time, it may have no value in case they don't enter anything. So we're going to put a little exclamation mark in the event that that happens. And now our compiler is happy. Now we're going to press enter. And what we're going to do now is reset whatever was in our text field box to put the same message in case they want to enter a different name to see how it looks, or maybe they misspelled the name, and we'll let them have their fun with it. So we're going to do name text field dot text is going to be equal to enter your name here. And this type right here is considered a string, and the text is also a type string. So it's just something you have to be careful of, that whatever it's expecting, that you input the right value type, because there are ints, doubles, and floats, and strings, and booleans, and so forth. And they all represent different types. And you'll see more of this later as we get into it. So, okay, this should change whatever is shown on our label and reset whatever's in our text field. So let's double check to make sure that our code is working for what we just defined. And this is a good thing to do in practice, to test incrementally, because now we know what to expect, and so we just have to make sure that that part functions properly. Otherwise, later parts may not function properly, and this may be the reason why. So we can enter our name here. I'm going to put Mr. Instructor. I will press submit. And we notice that something did change the label, but unfortunately not everything is showing. So we're going to put our simulator to sleep by pressing Command H. We're going to open up Xcode. And this is one of the interesting problems that you may run into, because label, once it's defined, it also has a defined boundary. And so anything extra will not show because it's limited in its boundary. There are ways around this. You could make the text smaller, or you could make the boundary bigger. One easy fix is we're going to do name label dot size to fit. And this will automatically update the label size to fit the size of the text. So if there's more text, the boundary will be bigger and it will display properly. So now we're going to test that out. We see hello. Okay, so far so good. Now we're going to put Mr. Instructor, submit, and it does work properly. Now if we notice, it looked nice before as it was all centered, and now it's slightly to the right. This is just visually unappealing to the user, generally speaking. So we're going to make sure that our label is always centered. So to do that, we're going to call name label, and we're going to look at a certain part of it. So we're going to look at the center of the object. So center.x will be equal to self.view.center.x. Yeah, so now we're going to talk about this a little bit just because it's an important concept. So what this does is make sure that the label is centered horizontally and across this axis vertically, just because x is from left to right, x-axis. And what this does, it looks at the certain aspect of the center of the label, which is right here on the x-axis, and we're going to set it equal to the value of this whole screen center value of x. This is important because we called it with self.view.center.x. So it looks at self, which is this whole view controller, and the whole view controller is just a screen. Then we're going to view it. We're going to look at its value of center and its value of x and set it equal and update the center of our label. Now we're going to do the same thing for y, just because it may not play an important part here, but as we change the font, it could. So we're going to do name label.center.y is equal to self.view.center.y. Okay, so now that should work properly. We're going to test it out just to make sure that we are right conceptually. Build succeeded, no errors, so that's a good sign. Now I'm going to try this again, but I'm going to use Mr. I as a shorthand. And again, in case you want to use the keyboard available on the simulator, you can press Command and K, and that will open it up for you. So I'm going to put Mr. I. Then you have to press Command K for it to go down again, unless you want to wait for it to time out. That option is up to you. You're going to press Submit, and it says, hello, Mr. I, and that is perfectly centered. So I'm happy for now, and the text field, of course, reset as expected. So now I'm going to press Command H, put the simulator back down to sleep. And now we're going to work with our slider. So right now, our slider doesn't do anything, but we wanted to change the size of the font. So we're going to start by getting the data of the slider, meaning like wherever it is, once the user interacts with it, what value is in here. Something to note, and you'll see it later, is that when the slider is all the way to the left, it has a value of 0, and when it's all the way to the right, it has a value of 1. This will make more sense shortly. For now, we're going to define a constant variable, and we're going to let size be equal to size of the slider dot value. That way we get its value. And this gives us a float value. It returns it just because it's from 0 to 1. And now we're going to do name label dot font, because we want to change the font, will be equal to name label dot font dot width size. And if you notice here, you can read the description. It returns a font object, which is the same as the receiver, but which has a specified size instead. This is important just because it doesn't update the font size itself, which is why I created this expression. And instead, it returns a similar font where the only difference is the size of the font. So our size will be size. That's what we want. And we notice that it cannot be converted because we have a float right here. But this method is expecting a CG float. A CG float is just a core graphics float, which could hold a value, and it has to do with storage. It's a specific kind of float, and which is more dynamic in how much memory it will give the variable. So we're going to do what's called typecasting here. So we're going to put the type that we want, as long as it is typecastable, and it is. So CG float, and then we're going to put in parentheses of what we want to typecast, which is our value float returned by the size slider.value. And this is looking pretty good right now. As discussed earlier, we want to make sure the name label updates its size on the border. So we're going to use size to fit. And this is just because, as experienced previously, we don't want large text not really be able to see it, and we don't, small text would be okay, but for the larger text, we want to consider the extremes of our program. So let's see what happens. I'm going to stop the previous one and start the simulation again. Build succeeded. Okay, everything looks good. What we wanted to see was what happened here. And we notice that it kind of disappears. But if you look closely by where my mouse is when I do it, you'll see that a speck kind of comes up. And this is because of what we discussed earlier, in which the slider only holds the value from 0 to 1. And so it does as it's told and changes the size of the font, but only with values 0 to 1. So we're going to want to create a scale function. So we're going to let scale. For our case here, remember we want it to be compatible with what we're going to be using. So we want our scale to be a type of CG float. We want it equal to 50. Let's see how that looks. And with here within our method, we're going to say size times scale. That way it should give us a larger value. As if this is a value of 0.5, it's right between 0 and 1, times 50, we'll get a font of 25, which is more or less what the reader would expect. And we do have our size to fit. So now we're going to try this again. We're going to stop the simulator, put it to sleep, and push play. So now let's test it out. So we notice we have a similar problem as earlier, where it's not centered. But as far as everything else goes, it seems to be doing fine. So I'm going to do Mr. I as a shorthand for my name. Push submit. It says, hello, Mr. I. So other than that, everything is working fine. We're going to go ahead and center our code and do some things to make our app more appealing to the user. So I'm going to press Command H, open up Xcode, and now we're going to do what we did for our last function. So name label dot center dot x will be equal to self dot view dot center dot x, and we're going to do name label dot center dot y. It's going to be equal to self dot view center.y. And again, this self variable, unfortunately I made that one capitalized where it's not supposed to be capitalized. It just refers to its own class. And right here is our view controller class. And again, our view controller class is this scene. So it's just referring to itself and its scene. So this should work well. And we tested it earlier over here. So we know that this code should work. And we're going to go ahead and add some constraints to our text field just to make it more visually appealing to the user. Because as we see, it's not entirely visually appealing. It is centered, but if we had it right here, no matter what we have in there and no matter what they type, if the name is longer than the text box, it starts to cut out some letters. So we want to make this as long as it can be because for its purpose, it would make it most applicable. So we're going to add new constraints to our text field. And it looks okay where it is, but I'm going to give it more distance from the top. Because if we look at here, this is representing the object. And the up arrow, or up bar, I guess you could say, represents the distance from the top to the next object above it. Of course, there's no object above it, so here it will make a reference to the top of the screen. And similarly, the sidebars would tell you the distance it could be, or should be, from the next object to the left of it, object to the right, and beneath it. But we're only going to add 3 constraints for now, just because it could change with the size font changing and the boundaries changing for our label. So we don't know how far we want it from the bottom object, but we do know how far we want it from the top object. I'm going to give it some more distance. I'm going to say 70 for the top, and I'm going to change the other ones. Be careful once you push enter because then it will close all constraints. So I'm going to push 0 and 0. And we can check here. Unfortunately, it does not look like it did what we wanted. So I'm going to select these constraints. And I'm going to delete it all. So you do want to be careful because say you want to delete a few, you can highlight them and press the delete button on your keyboard. It will delete it. But say you want to delete all constraints, so right here, say if we just clicked on all this, you would delete it and everything beneath it would be deleted. So we're going to click on this and try it again. We're going to add constraints to our text field. So we want this to be 70, that sounds about right. And we want this to be 0 and this to be 0 so that there's no distance from it and the objects left and right to it. We're going to press enter. And as we see here, that makes a nice text field from left to right of the screen. And so now we're going to push play. And see if everything works as expected. Okay, so we have our text field. So I'm going to put Mr. I for short. I'm going to submit it. It does look nice and centered. Everything's reset on the top. I can enlarge and make it as small as I want. So everything here works fine, and that is the main part for this project. Some warnings and things to keep in mind for this project. When looking at Xcode, earlier we used our control key to click and drag and make references for each of these instances. However, you want to be careful because if you were to accidentally make 2 similar references for the same object, it would lead to errors within your code, and after the user tries to interact with it, it could very well shut down the code and it may not work properly until the code is debugged. So say we made another name for this label, and I'm going to just call it label. It's there, and it won't give us an error, but later if we tried referencing it, it could very well give us an error, make the whole app crash. So something to keep in mind when doing references is you only want one type of reference per variable. This one has two references for our slider, but they are different because one is an outlet, whereas the other one is an action. To keep track of your references, you can click on View Controller. We want to look at our connections inspector, and it says all the connections per each object and variable that are made, along with our actions. So we had two, and that's okay, but we have one that we're not using and that would cause an error because these two reference the same thing. So we're not using label, so I'm just going to press the X, and then that reference is deleted. Of course, because if you were to just delete this code right here, it would not be enough as the reference may still be left there, and it's just best to delete it and double check in your connections inspector. Other than that, I hope this tutorial was useful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.